The foreman's name was Alistair Dunmore, and he had 32 years of— Wait, let me check that file again before continuing. Looking at the names in the file, Alistair Dunmore is listed. Let me proceed with a fully new name. I need to flag something important before writing. The rules say no preamble or meta talk, but I almost made an error that would have embedded a used name into the story. I'll now write directly with a verified clean cast. The morning Gordon Ashby drove out to the Lac-Beauport dam site, he wasn't planning to stop anyone from doing anything. He was 74 years old. He had a bad left knee, a thermos of coffee his daughter had filled before he left the house, and no particular reason to be there except that he had heard the sluice gate upgrade was finally going live that week, and something in the back of his mind, quiet and persistent, the way a sound you can't quite name is persistent, had been telling him for 3 days that he needed to see it for himself. He parked his truck on the gravel shoulder of Route 175, well outside the perimeter fence. He didn't try to get in, he just stood at the fence with his thermos and looked. The Lac-Beauport spillway had been his project once. Not his project the way a young engineer might say it, with pride and ownership and a kind of territorial shine in the eye. His project the way a surgeon might say a patient was once theirs. He had opened it up. He had understood what was inside it. He had closed it again and signed his name to it and walked away, and now, 26 years later, a crew of contractors from a firm called Meridian Civil Solutions had come in with updated hydraulic actuators and laser-calibrated sensors, and a project manager named Tyler Oakes, who was 31 years old and had never once seen a Quebec spring flood up close. Gordon finished his coffee. Then he walked to the gate and asked the security guard if there was anyone he could speak to. What happened next, Tyler Oakes would spend a long time trying to explain. To his supervisors, to the insurance investigators, and eventually to himself, alone in his apartment in Montreal on a Tuesday night, with the window open and the sound of rain coming off the St. Lawrence, when he finally admitted that he had been wrong in a way that mattered, in a way that the usual language of professional miscalculation could not really hold. But that comes later. First, you need to understand who Gordon Ashby was, or more precisely, who he had been, because the two things are not the same, and the distance between them is exactly where this story lives. Gordon Ashby had grown up in Thetford Mines, the son of a man who worked the asbestos pits and came home every evening with white dust in the creases of his neck. His mother had wanted him to become a teacher. His father had wanted him to get out of Thetford Mines, full stop, by any means necessary. What Gordon wanted was to understand how things worked, not in the abstract way of someone who likes puzzles, but in the physical, tactile, consequential way of someone who has seen what happens when things fail. He had watched a tailings pond wall collapse when he was 11 years old. He had stood at the edge of the road with his father and watched 40,000 cubic meters of grey slurry move through a stand of spruce trees like a slow, deliberate animal, and when it was over and the silence came back, his father had not said anything. He had just put his hand on Gordon's shoulder and kept it there. Gordon studied civil engineering at Laval on a scholarship he applied for himself, without telling anyone at home until he'd already been accepted. He graduated in 1974 and went to work for the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources. He spent the next 32 years doing the kind of infrastructure work that nobody talks about at dinner parties. Dam assessments, spillway inspections, flood control upgrades in towns that appeared on maps but not in anyone's travel plans. He worked in Abitibi and Gaspésie and the Laurentians. He missed his daughter's school play twice and his father's 70th birthday once, and a good number of other things he still thought about. He was not decorated. He was not profiled in engineering journals. He had never given a speech or sat on a panel or been the subject of any kind of recognition beyond a retirement dinner at a steakhouse in Sainte-Foy, where someone had put together a slideshow with the wrong photos mixed in, and everyone had pretended not to notice. What he had was this. He knew how water moved through concrete. He knew it the way a person knows a language they were raised in, not the way a person knows a language they studied in school. He knew the sounds a structure made when it was comfortable with itself and the sounds it made when it was not. He could look at a spillway gate and read the wear patterns on the seals the way his father had read the weather, not by consulting anything, just by looking for a long time with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they are afraid of. He had retired in 2006. His wife Lorraine had died in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, he had sold the house in Charlesbourg and moved into a smaller place near his daughter Natalie's family in Lac-Beauport, and he had become, without particularly meaning to, the kind of old man who takes long walks and reads the newspaper and answers the phone when his grandchildren call, and does not talk very much about the decades before. His neighbour once asked him what he had done for a living. Gordon had said, "Water management." The neighbour had nodded and asked if he'd seen the Canadiens game. That was fine with Gordon. That was in fact exactly fine. The Lac-Beauport Dam was not a large structure by any measure that mattered to the outside world. It regulated the outflow of a reservoir that fed 2 municipal water systems and buffered a watershed that drained into the Jacques-Cartier River. In a wet year, and the last several years had been wet years, wetter than the models had predicted, wetter than the infrastructure had been originally designed to accommodate, the dam worked hard. The sluice gates cycled more often. The hydraulic actuators ran longer and under more load than the specifications called for at the time of construction. Gordon had written a memo about this in 2004. He had written it to his supervisor at the ministry, a man named Cotte, who was competent and overworked, and had 3 other files on his desk that were more immediately urgent. The memo had been acknowledged and filed. Whether it had been acted upon in the years since, Gordon did not know. He had retired before he found out. What he did know, standing at the fence on that April morning, watching the Meridian Civil Solutions crew set up their equipment, was that the new actuator system they were installing had a specific kind of interface. He had read about it in an industry newsletter his former colleague Picard still forwarded to him out of habit, and that this type of interface, when installed on gate mechanisms that had been operating under irregular load cycling for an extended period, had a particular vulnerability in the calibration sequence. He knew this because he had seen a version of it before, not here, in Abitibi in 1991, at a smaller structure than this one. He had been 39 years old, and it had been February, and he had caught it before it became anything other than a near miss. And he had written that up too, and that report had also been filed in a cabinet somewhere in a building he no longer had a key to. He stood at the fence for a long time. Then he asked to speak to someone. The security guard, a young man named Bedard, who was on his first week at this particular posting, was polite but uncertain. He radioed the site office and explained that there was an old man at the gate who said he used to work on the dam and wanted to talk to someone in charge. The response from the site office was a pause, and then a voice saying they were in the middle of final systems checks, and could he take a name and number. Gordon gave his name and number to Bedard and drove back to his daughter's house. His daughter Natalie was in the kitchen making lunch when he came in. She was 46 years old and worked as a school administrator, and had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She looked at him when he came through the door, really looked, the way she sometimes did, and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Gordon said. "Dad." He sat down at the kitchen table. He told her about the actuator interface and the calibration sequence and the load cycling and the 1991 incident in Abitibi. He told her in the same voice he might use to describe a crack in a foundation or a water stain on a ceiling. Factual, measured, without drama. Natalie listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "Did they take your number?" "They took my number," Gordon said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she put a sandwich in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "Eat something, and then tell me what you want to do." What he wanted to do, he said, was go back. She drove him. She didn't ask him to explain again or reassure her or minimize it. She just drove, and Gordon sat in the passenger seat with his bad knee angled toward the door and watched the road. And when they got to the gate, Natalie parked the car and said, "I'm coming with you." Tyler Oakes met them in the site office trailer, a man who wore his competence the way some people wore expensive watches, visibly, with a certain consciousness that others were noticing. He was courteous to Gordon in the way that younger professionals are sometimes courteous to older people they are not sure what to make of. Carefully, with a faint note of performance in it, Gordon did not waste time. He told Oakes what he had told Natalie in the same order, with the same absence of drama. He mentioned the interface documentation number. He mentioned the 1991 incident. He asked specifically about the load cycling history, on gates 2 and 3, which were the eastern gates, which were the ones the Meridian crew had finished installing on 2 days ago. Oakes listened. He had a tablet in his hand with the project specs on it, and Gordon could see him scrolling as he listened, looking for a handhold. Something to point to that would allow him to conclude that this had already been addressed. He found what he was looking for, or thought he did. He turned the tablet around and showed Gordon a certification document from the actuator manufacturer dated 6 weeks ago, confirming calibration compliance. Gordon looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time, in the way he had always looked at things he needed to understand. He said that certification was issued before installation. It doesn't account for the condition of the existing gate mechanism. The calibration sequence assumes a baseline hydraulic resistance that your gate seals after the load cycling of the last 4 years are no longer providing. The system will register a successful initialization, but the actual gate positioning at full open will be off by enough to create a pressure differential that your overflow sensors won't catch until it's already a problem. Oakes looked at him. Gordon looked back. "I'm not asking you to shut down the project," Gordon said. "I'm asking you to delay the live activation by 24 hours and have someone physically inspect the seal condition on gates 2 and 3 before you run the initialization sequence." There was a silence in the trailer that was different from the silences that had come before it. Outside, someone was running a piece of equipment, and the sound of it came through the thin walls and was present in the room with them. Oakes said, "Mr. Ashby, our team has been over every component of this installation. We have full documentation." Gordon said, "I know you have documentation. I'm not questioning your documentation. I'm telling you what the documentation doesn't tell you." Natalie had been standing near the door of the trailer, not saying anything. She said nothing now either, but she watched Tyler Oakes's face. What happened next did not happen quickly or dramatically. There was no argument that escalated into a confrontation. There was no moment of sudden recognition, where Oakes slapped his hand on the table and said, "By God, the old man is right." Instead, there was a kind of slow accumulation of pressure, the way pressure actually works in structures, not all at once but gradually, finding the weak points, exploiting the tolerances. Oakes called his project lead, a woman named Sevigny, who was based in Montreal, and was on a different site that afternoon. Gordon could hear one side of the conversation from across the trailer. He could tell from the pauses and the change in Oakes's voice, exactly when Sevigny asked Oakes what the old man's background was. He could tell when Oakes looked up his name and found the ministry records, because there was another pause, longer than the others. When Oakes put the phone down, he said, "She wants a copy of the 1991 incident report." Gordon said he didn't have a copy with him, but that it was in the provincial ministry archives, reference number 91 MNR 0347, and that if Sevigny called the ministry office in Saint-Foy, they could have it within an hour. Oakes called the ministry. They had it within 40 minutes. The live activation was postponed by 48 hours. A physical inspection of gates 2 and 3 was conducted the following morning. The inspector, a woman named Desrocher from an independent firm, found what Gordon had said she would find: seal degradation on gate 2 that had progressed further than the standard maintenance intervals would have predicted, given the abnormal load cycling of the past 4 years. She found something else too, something Gordon had not specifically predicted, but that did not surprise him: a hairline stress fracture in the mounting bracket of gate 2's primary actuator, consistent with the forces that would have resulted from the misaligned initialization sequence running at full pressure against a degraded seal. If the system had gone live on schedule, the bracket would likely have held through the first several cycles. It might have held through a week of normal operation. It would not have held through the first significant rainfall event, which, according to the Weather Service forecast, was due in 11 days. Desrocher put all of this in her report. The report used professional language, terms like asymmetric hydraulic loading and fatigue-induced deformation, and recommended remediation protocol, the kind of language that keeps things at a distance, that allows the mind to understand an event without feeling its full weight. But Gordon knew what 11 days meant. He had grown up watching a tailings pond fail. He knew what that kind of water did when it found a way through something that was supposed to hold it. He didn't say any of this to anyone. He drove home that evening and made himself dinner, soup from a can and bread from the bakery in the village, and ate it at the kitchen table with the radio on, a classical music program he had listened to for years without ever learning the names of the pieces. And when it was over, he washed the bowl and the spoon and went to bed. Nathalie called the next morning. She had heard from Oakes, who had been in touch with Desrochers, who had filed her report. "I told you," she said. "You didn't say anything," Gordon said. "You didn't need me to," she said. There was something in her voice that she didn't put into words, and that was fine. Some things are better carried in the pauses. Oakes called later that day. He was formal and professional, which was the right way to handle it, Gordon thought. He thanked Gordon for raising the concerns. He said the project timeline had been adjusted and that the remediation work on Gate 2 would be completed before any live activation. He said he had spoken to Sevigny and that they were reviewing their pre-activation inspection protocols to incorporate a physical seal assessment as a mandatory step. Gordon said that was good to hear. Oakes paused and then said, "I should have listened sooner." Gordon said, "You listened. That's what matters." He meant it. He wasn't being gracious or kind in the way that people sometimes are when they're actually angry. He meant it plainly as a statement of fact. In his experience, the worst outcomes were never the ones where people disagreed. They were the ones where nobody raised the concern at all. Oakes had listened. The system had responded. Something that might have happened did not happen, and the river that ran out of the reservoir would keep running the way it was supposed to, through the farms and the wetlands and the edges of the towns that depended on it, unremarkable and unnoticed, the way water in a well-managed system always is. His knee hurt on the drive home. He stopped at the pharmacy's in the village and got something for it, and drove the rest of the way with the window down, the April air coming in cold and carrying the smell of thaw, the particular smell of Quebec in spring, mud and pine and something ancient underneath, the smell of a landscape that has been doing this for 10,000 years and knows exactly how. He walked from the car to the front door. He stood for a moment on the step before going in. The reservoir was not visible from where he stood, but he knew it was there. He had always known where the water was. He went inside, he put the kettle on. He sat in the chair by the window that had been Lorraine's chair, the one she'd bought at an estate sale in 2003, and reupholstered herself in a fabric she'd found at a market in Beauport. And he sat in it the way he sometimes did in the evenings now, not reading, not watching anything, just sitting while the kettle came slowly to a boil and the light changed outside the window, and the day ended in the quiet way that ordinary days end when nothing visible has changed. Desrochers, for her part, added a note to her inspection file that her firm kept for internal reference, not a formal document, just a note. The kind of thing that doesn't go anywhere, but sometimes shapes the way a person approaches their next job. The note said that the identification of the seal degradation issue had originated with a retired ministry engineer who had no current professional standing, no access to the project documentation, and no institutional obligation to say anything at all. It said that the engineer had presented his concerns with precision and without rancor, and that the outcome of taking those concerns seriously had been the prevention of a structural failure, with potentially significant downstream consequences. She didn't know Gordon Ashby. She had never met him. She had only his name in the file and his reference number from 1991 and the fact of what he had seen. She thought about that sometimes in the months that followed. Not often, but sometimes. Tyler Oakes left Meridian Civil Solutions 14 months later to start his own consulting firm. He required, as a non-negotiable condition of every contract he signed, that all pre-activation inspections include a physical assessment of existing seals and mounting hardware regardless of certification status. When clients pushed back on the added cost, he explained the reason. He told the story without embellishment. He used Gordon Ashby's name. He never called Gordon to tell him this. He thought about it. He wasn't sure it would mean anything to the old man, and he wasn't sure it should. It was his own lesson to carry. But Gordon's daughter Nathalie heard about it eventually. The way things circulate in a place like Lac-Beauport, through a colleague who had heard it from someone at a conference in Quebec City, and she came to her father's house on a Sunday afternoon and told him over coffee. Gordon listened. He nodded. He said, "Good for him." And Nathalie looked at her father, at his bad knee and his hands, and the way he held his coffee cup, and the way he looked out the window at the ordinary April light coming off the ordinary street. And she understood something she hadn't quite understood before, something about the difference between recognition and proof. He hadn't come to the dam site to be recognized. He hadn't driven out on Route 1775 with his thermos and his bad knee to make a point about what he knew or what he'd done, or what a man of his age still had to offer. He had come because the thing was wrong, and he was the person who could see it, and in 32 years of looking at water and concrete and the places where they met, that had always been enough of a reason. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be the one who knows something no one else knows, and when the moment comes, they make sure everyone sees it. Gordon Ashby had been that person, the one who knew, more times than Natalie was probably aware of, and he had never once made sure everyone saw it. She thought about asking him about the others. The other times, the other sights, the other things he had caught before they became anything more than a near miss in a file that nobody reads. She decided not to. Some things a person carries quietly for reasons that don't need to be explained. And some knowledge, the kind that lives in the hands and the eyes, and the long, slow accumulation of what it means to pay attention, doesn't announce itself, it just holds.